Dear friend, thank you so much for listening to my talk focusing on consumer exposure to disinfecting chemicals against COVID-19 and resulting health risks. This is Li, greeting from Reno, Nevada, United States. It is not exaggerated to say disinfection has become a daily habit of almost all of us since the COVID pandemic. Let's reflect on how we use cleaning products on hard surface at home. No matter whether you use sprays or wipes, most of us just let disinfected surfaces air dried without wiping them up after use, right? In this situation, disinfectant would stay on surfaces all day long. But remember, these surfaces are high-touch surfaces. Each time when we touch the surface, because of the abrasion or rub, a certain amount of disinfecting chemicals would be transferred from the surfaces to our hands. Such surface to hand transfer is particularly pronounced for kids because kids love to climb or crawl on all kinds of different surface, like table surface or countertops. Kids also love to play with objects like toys, like electronics. When they touch this stuff, disinfectant would migrate to the skin of their palms or the fingers. Then, when our kids lick or bite their hands, they would take in disinfectants. We give this whole process a name, mouthing media ingestion. I should emphasize that what is being ingested here is not only dust, but also surface residue of disinfectant. That is a very tiny, very thin layer of disinfectant molecules left on the surface. So dust ingestion is only a part of the total mouthing media ingestion. Mouthing media ingestion matters not only for children. Believe it or not, adults are also victims. I'm pretty sure you have seen this very amusing image at the beginning of the COVID. A health official kept warning the public not touch their mouths, but then she herself unintentionally licked a finger. But I would still say mouthing is still less frequent for teenagers and adults. So our research is to evaluate consumer exposure to COVID disinfectants. We have two aims, one being to understand the magnitude of human exposure to disinfecting chemicals applied to indoor hard surfaces, and the other being to warn health risks associated with this exposure. We actually don't talk about exposure in the duration of disinfection because we believe we often have masks or gloves on when we do the disinfection. Instead, we care more about exposure after disinfection, which is called post-application human exposure. By human exposure, we are going to consider three exposure routes: mouthing media ingestion, which is our focus; dermal absorption of gases, chemicals from the indoor air, and dust-borne chemicals from the indoor surfaces; and inhalation. For disinfecting chemicals, we consider 22 chemicals. They are used as active ingredients in cleaning products recommended by health and environmental authorities in 4 countries. Actually, in addition to these 4 countries, you can also find these disinfecting chemicals on the list of cleaning products in other countries. Among these 22 chemicals, 14 are quaternary ammonium chemicals, or QACs. These chemicals can dissociate on hard surfaces, so they are very difficult to turn into gas. At the same time, they can be relatively rapidly broken down inside the human body. On the other hand, we have 8 other chemicals. Most of them are phenols. As we know, phenols are easy to evaporate from disinfected surfaces. And I believe you may be familiar with some of the chemicals on the list, like triclosan. This compound is quite persistent inside the human body. We collect the properties of these compounds, like their tendencies of partitioning between different phases, degradation rate constants, and biotransformation in the human body. We give the highest priority to experimentally determine the values. If they are not available, we compute numbers using quantitative structure property relationship, or QSPRs. And then we put all these properties into a comprehensive fate and exposure model, which is called PROTAX. So PROTAX was developed by our team. So it contains an indoor fate and transport module. That is, if we know how much of the disinfectant is used, then this module can predict the concentration of disinfecting chemicals in the indoor compartments. We parameterize this module to represent an average home in the US. At the same time, PROTAX also contains a human exposure and toxicokinetic module. It predicts how much a person takes in disinfecting chemicals if this person breathes and touches all kinds of indoor surfaces. It also predicts the blood concentration result from this exposure because it describes all kinds of elimination processes. We parameterize this module to represent a typical female white American. PROTAX is dynamic. It allows simulating the life course of exposure from the person's birth to the death. So we can extract the modeling result for whatever range we want. We assume that 3 square meters of hard surfaces in this room are disinfected once a day. Disinfectants are used at a full strength without dilution, and the disinfectants are not wiped off after disinfection. With these assumptions, PROTAX tells us external and internal exposures. Let's just first look at the estimate of daily uptake expressed as the mass of disinfectant per mass of body weight per day. Because input parameters are characterized as ranges, the estimated daily uptake is also a range. We use a bar to express the range of the best estimate and the most conservative estimate. We do the simulation for different age groups, 3, 14, and 25 years old. We repeatedly simulate for individual compounds. Looking at the result, we can see the uptake rate varies between chemicals by almost 3 orders of magnitude. Basically, we can find the daily uptake of QACs is higher than that of other disinfecting chemicals. This is because QACs are permanently charged, so they are minimally volatile. Compared to other chemicals, they can remain on disinfected surfaces for a long time. If we compare between different age groups, we can find that the 3-year-old key have a generally higher uptake than the 14-year-old teenagers and the 25-year-old adults. This is because kids mouth their hands a lot more frequently than teenagers and adults. PROTAX also allows us to predict blood concentrations of these compounds. We can see blood concentration varies by almost 5 orders of magnitude. Trichlorcarbon and triclosan have higher blood concentrations than other disinfecting chemicals, especially QACs. This is because trichlorcarbon and triclosan are biotransformed much slowly than QACs. As expected, 3-year-old kids have generally higher blood concentration than the 14-year-old teenagers and 25-year-old adults. You see, these are just numbers, right? But what do these numbers mean in terms of human health risks? To determine the health risk, we need to compare exposure with a toxicological threshold. If the estimated exposure is above the toxicological threshold, then we see the exposure cause health concerns. This is just like we compare the speed you drive with the speed limit of the road to determine whether you have the risk to get a traffic ticket. We can do this in two ways. The first way is to compare the daily uptake with the in vitro maximum acceptable dose, which means the minimum amount of chemical posing systemic toxicity to human body. But you can see the maximum acceptable dose is not available for every single chemical in our work. If the estimated uptake is way higher than the maximum acceptable dose, then we see the person is at risk. For a single chemical, we may find a couple of maximum acceptable dose at the same time. So you can see they are expressed as a range. So the conclusion on whether the exposure is risky or not also depends on whether you use the optimistic or conservative end of this rate. For example, for cyclomonium bromide, you can find all age groups are at risk, but for thymol, you can find all age groups are at no risk, no matter whether the optimistic or conservative end of this range is used. For trichlorcarbon and triclosan, you can find that all age groups are at risk if the conservative end is used. So the key message on this slide is that if we use systemic toxicity as a criterion, exposure to some of these compounds is somewhat risky. We can also assess the health risks in another way by comparing the blood concentration with a bioactivity threshold. The bioactivity threshold is calculated based on AC50. That is the concentration where half maximal activity occurs in cytotoxicity assays in ToxCast. For thymol, you can find all age groups at no risk, no matter whether the optimistic or conservative threshold is used. But for trichlorcarbon, you can find that all age groups are at risks if the conservative end is used. So the key message on this slide is, if we use bioactivity as a criteria, exposure to most of these chemicals is not risky. And if you recall what has been described before, you will find that using the two ways of assessment gives quite different profiles of risks. So our work also raises a very interesting question for future work. For what reason? The two approaches give quite different results. To sum up, we can expect high disinfecting chemical exposure of children through mouthing media injection if disinfecting chemicals are readily ionized and thus minimally volatile. And disinfecting chemicals are left on high-touch hard surfaces without being wiped off after use. So if we want to do something to protect the health of our kids, we may use disinfectants that are more volatile, like alcohols, instead of QACs, for indoor surfaces with which kids are in frequent contact, or can wipe up excess disinfectants after disinfecting surfaces accessible to kids. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. This study has been published last year in Environmental International. If you want more information about results in this talk, please scan this QR code or contact me via lili@unr.edu. I hope you stay healthy and safe.